Well, Diptyque Laurent is with us here on set. Diptyque, today's focus entirely on the trial of these 14 suspects involved in the Charlie Hebdo terror attacks.
That's right. And on that occasion, the satirical French magazine Charlie Hebdo has republished some of the controversial cartoons about the Prophet Mohammed and Islam that allegedly sparked those terror attacks here in France. It's a front page that's garnering a lot of attention in the papers today. All this for that, tout ça pour ça, that's what the paper says on its, the magazine says on its front page. We will never take it lying down. We will never give up. The publication's editor-in-chief Rees writes today, I quote, he says, "The hate that struck us is still here, and since 2015 it has transformed, it's morphed into something that goes by unnoticed and yet continues its relentless crusade." He also writes that the decision to publish the cartoons has been always about conveying a message. He writes that he's refused, for instance, to publish other caricatures of Muhammad, quote, because he wanted a good reason to do so and do it in order to bring something to the debate.
What about the process itself? The French papers are calling it historic, aren't they?
That's right. Libération calls it historic on its front page. For them, for us, for history, the paper says, calling the trial unprecedented, one that will be a very long trial. And you see Libération, we're quite used to normally very vibrant front pages from Libération. Today is very sober, reflecting the mood here in France. It's a, quote, cathartic trial which will contribute to the shared history of a painful memory, and the verdict which will be given will have one objective: to reinforce democracy against darkness. The Catholic paper La Croix, like others, going with a picture on its front page of those protests from the I Am Charlie movement. It's time for justice, the paper says on its front page. But it's interesting in the editorial, it says, let's take things with a grain of salt as well. This is an extremely complicated trial. It involves only those implicated really in a second degree, because the principal terrorists were killed, of course, by police in 2015. Is it worth it? The paper says absolutely, because it will allow victims to have their say. I quote, "The terrorists should not have the final word."
It's not just here in France either. The trial's also garnering interest in the foreign press, you found.
Yeah, there's a really interesting front page from Le Temps, the Swiss paper, that says that justice is facing the ghosts of Charlie today. The cartoonist Chapat on the front page sees the scales of justice as representing on one side the guns of the terrorists, and on the other side Charlie Hebdo's drawing pen. The paper noting that judges will be trying to really untangle these chilling attacks, but that lots of questions could still remain after. It is in many ways a, quote, impossible trial. Well, let's end with Politico, the website which looks at the legacy of the I Am Charlie movement that we mentioned earlier. The publication actually calls it a show trial, one which will be filmed and preserved for posterity, which is the first in French judicial history. So in that sense, it's quite unprecedented. I Am Charlie came to represent for many an attack on the French and Western way of life. What's left of that movement 5 years on? Well, Politico says there are two things. Free speech, which is, quote, in poor shape today in 2020, something that the Charlie Hebdo editor also evoked between cancel culture and denying people platforms. It seems like we've sort of, instead of advancing free speech, we've sort of withdrawn into it. On the other hand, the publication notes that support for the French far right isn't any stronger today than it was, for instance, in 2014, which seems to indicate that 2015 wasn't, in fact, France's 9/11 moment.
Diptyque, thanks very much. Diptyque Laurent on France 24. A lot more coverage, of course, of that story.